attack Papias of Hierapolis apostolic hearer, guardian of gospel origins. Papias' own testimony, as preserved by Eusebius. Papias explains his sources for gospel information. Papias opens his work by explaining how he gathered apostolic testimony. Open quote, "I shall not hesitate to set down for you, along with my interpretations, everything I carefully learned from the elders and carefully remembered, guaranteeing its truth." Close quote. Eusebius, Ecclesiastical History, 3.39.3. He then explains why his testimony is reliable. Open quote, "For I did not suppose that information from books would help me so much as the utterances of a living and abiding voice." Close quote. Eusebius, EH 3.394. Papias presents himself as a faithful collector of eyewitness tradition, not a later theorist. 2. Papias names the apostolic sources of gospel tradition. Papias explicitly names the apostles whose teaching stands behind the Gospels. Open quote, "If anyone came who had followed the elders, I would inquire about the words of the elders, what Andrew or Peter said, or Philip, or Thomas, or James, or John, or Matthew, or any other of the Lord's disciples." Close quote. Eusebius, EH 3.39.4. This shows apostolic oral teaching, apostolic continuity, apostolic authority behind the written Gospels. 3. The crucial present tense testimony. Aristion and John, living gospel witnesses. Papias then adds a second category of witnesses. Open quote, "And what Aristion and John, the disciples of the Lord, say." Close quote. Eusebius, EH 3.39.4. Key points, stated, not critiqued. Present tense, say, living teachers, direct disciples of the Lord, still transmitting gospel tradition. Papias is recording living apostolic testimony that informs gospel origins. Papias on the authorship of Mark. Papias gives the earliest preserved statement on who wrote the Gospel of Mark. Open Quark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote accurately all that he remembered of the things said or done by the Lord, though not in order. Close quote. Open quote. He made no mistake, for he had one concern, to omit nothing he had heard and to falsify nothing. Close quote. Eusebius, EH 3.39.15. Testimony given. Mark is the author. Peter is the eyewitness source. Accuracy and faithfulness emphasized. V. Papias on the authorship of Matthew. Papias also preserves early testimony about Matthew. Open quote. Matthew composed the sayings of the Lord in the Hebrew language, and each one interpreted them as he was able. Close quote. Eusebius, EH 339.16. Testimony given. Matthew is the author. Apostolic origin. Early composition. Rooted in Jewish Christian context. V6. What the church said about Papias' testimony. 1. Irenaeus, open quote, Papias, a hearer of John and a companion of Polycarp, a man of ancient times. Close quote. Irenaeus, Against Heresies 5.33.4. This affirms Papias as a trustworthy transmitter of apostolic gospel tradition. 2. Jerome, open quote. Papias, bishop of Hierapolis, a hearer of John, wrote 5 books of expositions of the sayings of the Lord, close quote. Jerome, De Viris Illustribus 18. Jerome explicitly ties Papias to gospel sayings and apostolic sources. The 7th. Polycrates of Ephesus, Johannine context. Polycrates confirms the apostolic environment in Asia where Papias lived and taught. Open quote. John, who leaned on the Lord's breast, Polycarp of Smyrna, all these observed the true tradition. Close quote. Eusebius, EH 5.24.2-7. This situates Papias within the same Johannine gospel-preserving churches. Vate, the Marcionite Prologue, Hercle Witness. The Marcionite Prologue to Luke, 2nd century. Even the Marcionite tradition preserves testimony about gospel authorship. Open quote. Luke was a Syrian of Antioch, a physician by profession, a disciple of the apostles. Later he followed Paul until his martyrdom. Close quote. Marcionite Prologue to Luke preserved in Latin manuscripts, 2nd century source material. What this shows, Luke is named as author. Luke is connected to apostolic authority. Luke is associated with Paul. Even a hostile tradition preserves apostolic attribution. Ein, Eusebius's full preservation of Papias on gospel origins. Eusebius preserves Papias on 1. His method of collecting apostolic testimony, EH 3393. 2. Preference for living witnesses, EH 339.4. 3. Apostles named as gospel sources, EH 339.4. 4. Aristion and John speaking in the present tense, EH 3.39.4. 5. Mark as Peter's interpreter, EH 3.39.15. 6. Matthew as author of the sayings, EH 3.6 final summary, Gospel authorship only. According to Papias in the early church, Mark wrote from Peter's testimony. Matthew authored the sayings of the Lord. Gospel tradition came from apostles and living disciples. John's teaching stood at the center of Asian Christianity. Papias received this information directly from apostolic witnesses.